Don Pittham. Originally from Rugby in the English Midlands, Don and his wife moved to New Zealand in 1988. Don is a strong believer that variety is the spice of life. His experience as a teacher, computer designer, dairy farmer, tamarillo grower, builder's labourer, picture framer and photographer would seem to indicate that he has enjoyed a very spicy life. Don's interest in photography, combined with his seeing eye, has resulted in successful exhibitions and even participation in the dreaded area of wedding photography. Moving to Nelson in 2003, with its nearby national parks, sparked a passion for capturing images of native flora. Don's photographs appear in the calendars, diaries and books published by Potton and Burton, who are kind enough to describe him as one of New Zealand's leading botanical photographers. Alone. I can understand why the photographer wished to capture this scene. It's a pretty sad sight. The single remaining dead tree in what appears to be a destroyed landscape. Is this the result of flooding? I can't read the full story from the image. The sky with its wispy clouds seems the strongest component of the picture. It alone looks untouched by whatever has caused the devastation to the other elements that make up the image. The colours of the sky and the land are working well together to produce some drama. However, on my screen, the image still appears rather dull and flat. Increasing the contrast would help to make this a more impressive picture. No award. Bridal Veil Falls. Water is a favourite subject for photographers. Two approaches to photographing flowing water are either with a very fast shutter speed to capture every drop and splash possible, or alternatively with a very slow shutter speed to blur the water into an apparently milky flow. Sadly, with this image, the photographer seems to have used a shutter speed that falls between these two options. The result lacks detail in the falls, but also fails to produce the more abstract artistic interpretation of the milky flow. Some photographers would advocate extreme post-production to correct this situation, but this judge advocates the old-fashioned remedy of, if possible, revisiting the scene, putting the camera on a tripod and trying both the alternative approaches mentioned. A revisit and a reshoot is likely to be better for your body, mind and soul than sitting in front of a computer messing around trying to make this image something it isn't. A good location and a good idea that hasn't quite come off. No award. Derelict. I would love to know the circumstances under which this image was made. Why has the vehicle been photographed at night? Was it somewhere the photographer was not supposed to be? Did the photographer actually dump the derelict themselves at night and decided they wanted a record shot as a memento? Was the photographer travelling through the night and miles away from home came upon the scene and thought, snap it now or never? Wondering about the rationale behind the making of this picture is, I'm afraid, occupying my mind more than putting forward constructive comments on the quality of the image. The artificial light, from the headlights of another vehicle possibly, allows us to see the subject of the shot but fails to provide us with any scene-setting details. It is those details that would tell the full story. A picture of a derelict vehicle in a scrapyard awaiting recycling is a different narrative to a derelict dumped by some unsociable member of society in a pristine nature location. If the photographer was legally in the area, wasn't the culprit who dumped the truck, and wasn't miles away from home when they made the photograph, please would they return and remake the photograph in daylight? No award. Leaving Devonport. As far as technical aspects such as exposure and shutter speed is concerned, there is little wrong with this picture. However, in terms of creativity and communication, the image falls short. How could it be improved? Maybe giving more context would help. Rather than a bland blue sky, could we have been shown some details of Devonport where the plane had just departed? Some roofs, roads, surrounding landscape. Also be aware of the dynamics of composition. Flat lines instill a feeling of calm and restfulness. Diagonal or oblique lines make an image more dynamic. So rather than depicting the plane flying parallel to the base of the picture, which signifies here we are toddling along boringly with not a care in the world angle, it is so that we are given a yay, wow, we're up and away, look at us, yippee message. My prescription to cure plane pictures lacking in drama is for the photographer to visit an airport and make 100 distinctly different aeroplane in-flight images. No award. Pearl in a oyster. You can fool some of the people some of the time. You know the rest of the saying. Between you and me, I don't believe this is an oyster and I don't believe that this is a pearl. Having myself played with flash-captured shots of items dropped into liquids, I'm pretty sure that this is the scenario we are dealing with in this entry. The splash or oyster is acceptably well captured, but unfortunately I cannot rid my belief system of the thought that the pearl or white circle looks most unnatural. It appears as if it has been cloned into the image via Photoshop or something similar. Perhaps I should be kind and consider that the flash has completely burnt out any detail on a sphere that has been dropped into the liquid. Nevertheless, it still looks unreal. Cropping off some of the lighter area above the oyster and making the boundary between that lighter area and the darker area horizontal might improve the picture. An interesting image, but not one that tells a strong story for me. No award. Small aurora. Although my screen is calibrated, I began to have doubts about the accuracy of the calibration when I viewed this picture. I realise that it's a nighttime shot, but even so it seems overly dark. A check of the image's histogram shows that there is the possibility of lightening the image considerably without losing the detail of the subject matter. The jetty works well to act as a foreground, setting the scene and providing scale for the reflections of the aurora in the water. With adjustment, this image will be regarded well, but as presented, it receives no award. Sun worshipper. Yes, he or she does look as if they are enjoying the warmth of a sunny day. This, however, is anthropomorphizing the situation, and in all likelihood, Mr. or Mrs. Spider is probably simply on the lookout for their next meal. I am no spider expert, but I suspect that this is a very, very small creature. That has presented problems for the photographer. On top of the worry of photographing the subject before it runs or jumps away, the main concern is how to achieve both: a suitable depth of field and acceptable sharpness with a fast shutter speed. The eyes are the sharpest parts of the image, as they should be when photographing any animal, though even here there is room for a little further sharpening. But most of the rest of the spider lacks sufficient sharpness. The background has the appearance of a man-made fabric, which in some competitions may negate the feasibility of using this as a natural history entry. The only advice I can proffer in this case is similar to that given to the photographer of the aeroplane shot. Find and photograph 100 spiders in 100 different ways to eventually discover what works best. Well done for attempting this difficult subject matter. Do please try again. No award. The Acropolis with moon rising. This is probably an image that resonates more with the photographer who made the picture and being there experienced all of the human senses and memories associated with the scene, as opposed to a viewer of the picture who can only use their sense of sight to interpret the image put before them. I found the intermingling of the trees with the rock wall confusing and disturbing, and the colour saturation of the rock face unreal and garish. Hard words perhaps, but wait. While attempting to see the result of reducing the colour saturation, I completely desaturated the image and, lo and behold, after a bit of adjustment to the lighting and contrast, ended up with an image that reminded me most strongly of one of Ansel Adams' famous black and white landscapes. I'm afraid that I don't really have any specific advice on how to overcome the problems that I noted when viewing the image. However, the photographer should take heart in being able to tell their friends that the judge drew a comparison between their picture and the work of the famous American photographer Ansel Adams. No award. Tiger Baby. Do keep this image. Then in years to come, when the child featured is enjoying their coming of age party or their wedding reception, you can display the picture and embarrass the living daylights out of them. Well done to the photographer for having fun with their photography. However, I think that maybe some restraint would have resulted in a more successful image. The tiger clothing, the whiskers, and the red nose work well, but the implanted eyes detract from the natural eyes, the so-called windows of the soul. People prefer to see people happy, so capturing the tiger smiling would have encouraged viewers to reciprocate with a smile of their own. Also, be careful of surrounds. There is an imperfection in the top left-hand area of this surround, and I'm not convinced that the red colouring really works with the orange of the tiger costume. A fun idea that needs repeating for perfection. No award. Winter beauty. I believe that the beauty in question is the camellia. This still life has been carefully presented against a suitably delicate background and illustrates to the viewer not only the camellia flower, but also the leaves and flower bud of the bush. The controlled, gentle lighting gives an indication of form to the flower. I suspect that in attempting to achieve a delicate appearance with an out-of-focus background, the photographer has chosen an aperture that has resulted in an insufficient depth of field. Thus, one edge of the leaf and the distant petals are sharply in focus, while the nearer petals are unsharp. A potentially creative image that hasn't quite achieved its full potential. No award. A mouthful. I'm a firm believer that for amateurs, photography should be fun. The strength of this competent image is underlined by the title. Although the pelican is sharply depicted with well-lit feather detail and even a catchlight in the eye, the photographer has realised that the background birds, ibis I think, really detract from the image as far as a formal nature picture is concerned. However, one of those birds makes the shot, when humour is the name of the game. A good acceptance. Incoming storm. To avoid any confusion, this is actually titled Approaching Storm on my list of entries. Beware. Specified titles that don't tie up with the file names are one of the common occurrences and pet hates for salon organisers. Regardless, the forthcoming storm is quite obvious in those dark brooding clouds. After noting the black sky and observing what seems to be an island landform, my attention is drawn to the fence. This pleasingly supplies a sort of leading line taking my view from one side of the image to the other and back again. But then I reach what I might call the and then moment. I'm expecting something more, something to happen, a consequence of the weather situation. Unfortunately, the something more isn't forthcoming. Perhaps a human presence is needed, maybe someone looking out to sea holding onto their hat to emphasise the wind blowing. This is certainly a competent image, but it is lacking that certain extra that will lift it above the level of an acceptable record shot. An acceptance. Photographer at sunset. I spent a little while trying to decide if this image really is about the photographer or it is about the sunset and the photographer. As photographers are apt to do, just got in the way. I suspect in reality the sunset and the feeling of the moment had more impact than is provided by this image. After looking at the elements of the landscape, the foreground rocks, headland houses, distant sea, dramatic sky, I found myself searching for a focal point. That's where the photographer came in. To make the photographer the undoubted star of this show, without losing the impact of the sunset and the setting, I suggest that the image be cropped at the top to remove a fair section of the sky, at the bottom to remove a small area of the rocks and a little on the right-hand side. Carefully done, this will leave the photographer on one of the thirds of the image. This will emphasise the photographer's significance and satisfy all those judges who are obsessed by putting everything on the thirds. An acceptance. Touch of Japan. The cherry blossom with the red pergola set in lush green shrubbery and surrounded by bright, what I suspect are azaleas. Certainly a touch of Japan. This colourful image is well composed with the focal point pergola pleasingly off-centre and partially framed by the overhanging cherry branches. I'd certainly be keen to relax in solitude and ponder the ways of the world, or perhaps just the ways of nature, in this setting. The image might be considered by some to be too busy. This could be overcome by cropping to a square format, with the width of the square being the full width of the image and the bottom of the square being positioned just above the red flowers in the bottom right-hand corner. Competent and pleasing work. An acceptance. Waratah fungi. An interesting presentation of fungi that, from the image title, are growing out of the top of a waratah. It's late at night and I'm becoming tired, so with my sincere apologies to the photographer concerned, the dialogue that follows provides an insight into the Sherlock Holmes style of thinking of a need-to-be-convinced judge. The fungi appear to be in very good condition, Holmes. Perhaps a little too good for my liking, Watson. Usually there is at least one blemish, a tear in the cap, a snail trail, pieces of debris from nearby plant or bush that have drifted onto the fruiting bodies. But here, my dear doctor, friend, we seem to have perfect caps. The background is unobtrusive, Holmes. Perhaps too unobtrusive for my taste in backgrounds, Watson. It's mainly black, lacking any indication of the setting where the fungi was photographed. It's suspicious, Watson. The naturally sharpest element of the image seems to be the wood in front of the fungi, Holmes. Yes, there's something going on here, Watson. Possibly a misplaced focusing point. The actual fungi have the appearance of being over-sharpened. I think, Watson, that we may be dealing with a case of post-processing excess. Some blurring will be needed to redeem the situation. Is something really afoot, Holmes? Are you absolutely sure about all your concerns? No, Watson, I'm not. So until we have any really damning evidence, we'll have to believe the photographer innocent. So you mean, Holmes? Yes, Watson, we'll have to make this image an acceptance. Yellow-tailed black cockatoo. An image with an I'm looking at you, you're looking at me feel to it. Being unfamiliar with this species, I looked it up on the web, where I read that it's the largest of the Australian cockatoos. The web also provided me with an option of viewing over 3,000 photographs of the bird. You may not think that this is overly good news if you are a photographer aiming to impress a judge with your particular image of a yellow-tailed black cockatoo. However, I'm pleased to report that this image fared very well compared to many of the foliage-obscured, bad-angled, distant, cut-off, out of focus and plain not worth putting on the web images I had the patience to look at courtesy of Mr. Google. This competent shot defines the relevant facets that identify the bird, shows good eye and feather detail, and sets the bird in its natural habitat. Perhaps our interest could have been increased by being shown the cockatoo involved in more vigorous activities, feeding, mating, nesting, whatever, and in an open competition, that annoying broken branch at the base of the picture could have been cloned out. However, as an identifying image of the yellow-tailed black cockatoo, this picture certainly hits the mark. Well done, a good acceptance. Edge of the world. I know judges who prefer not to know the title of an image. They say that the image should speak for itself. I am not of that opinion. In the arts, most books, poetry and paintings have titles. Films and theatre productions are often accompanied by music, and in general, the different types of art can be happily combined to create a presentation that is both informative and pleasurable to the recipients. I believe that image titles give a strong clue as to the thought process of the photographer when they made the image. The title helps to tell the story. This image really does have an edge of the world look about it. Surely we have all looked out to sea and wondered, what's out there? If we travelled far enough, would we reach America or Africa? The picture has an end-of-day gentleness about it, which, considering The potential for brutality of some of the depicted elements, the sea and the sun, is somewhat surprising, but nevertheless pleasing and reassuring. Potential changes. I'm not too convinced by the yellow tones in the image. Perhaps bluer tones in the sea would make me happier. I wonder if introducing a solitary figure looking out to sea would strengthen an already strongly communicated image. Highly commended. Mixed berries. A delicious looking entry. Raspberries, some type of blackberry, strawberries and blueberries. There should be a rule that forbids photo entries that cause the judge to salivate. Although on my screen this image could be improved by lightening the whole picture and increasing the sharpness a tad, as presented, it is still a competent creative still life. However, I'm sure the photographer would like me to point out some possible picky improvements. Even if they wouldn't, I'm going to, so there. In the old days, photography assistants would be sent out to find perfect props for still life shots. This means that the central strawberry in this shot would have been rejected because it's starting to look bruised, but it has not decayed sufficiently to become significant as an element in the image. Those of the Dutch school of painters who specialised in still lifes, including flowers, would almost always avoid portraying patterns. They would have rejected the line of raspberries followed by a line of blackberries followed by a circle of strawberries that we see in this picture as being too formulaic. Instead, they would have either mixed those elements up randomly or, more likely, shown them as groups. I'm not saying that the photographer should blindly follow the examples of the Dutch painters, but simply to bear in mind that in their time those painters seem to have been very successful, so maybe there are lessons to be learnt there. If the photographer is now thinking, this judge is a veritable pain in the backside, or something like that, just think that you can say to your friends, guess what? The judge compared my work to the Dutch masters. Highly commended. Outback palette. There's a lot to absorb in this colourful image. The trees, the cliffs, the background, water, the foreground grassland and the clouded sky. It's all interesting, but for me, a bear of little brain, it's rather too much. Perhaps the image could be simplified and our attention refined by cropping off most of that foreground grassland. The resulting panorama format picture then allows us to concentrate on the two main facets of the image, the tree leaning in towards and being welcomed, as it were, by the orange slopes of the cliffs. A well-seen, competent and appealing image. Highly commended. Swallows in spring. I enjoy the energy of the swallows that is apparent in this well-made shot. The seemingly raucous mouthing off of the lower bird, though perhaps it's a youngster demanding food, and the quiet, gentle but powerful flight of the higher bird effectively contrasts the behaviour of the subjects. I feel that the image has potential to be improved by some post-processing, providing that the original shot is of sufficient resolution. Some cropping on all sides, but particularly on the bottom of the image, to remove all of that out of focus section of the perching post would concentrate more attention on the birds. A slight increase in contrast would also give the image more impact. Highly commended. White-faced heron. A competent nature shot, and I'm pleased to see that the heron has been depicted doing something rather than just standing inactive and motionless. Although we don't have catchlight in the bird's eye, the eye is well defined, as are the detail of the heron's feathers. Without being intrusive or distracting, the background is indicative of the bird's natural habitat. Again, on my screen, the image looks as if it could benefit from an all-round brightening, and reference to the histogram shows that this is possible without loss of detail in the picture. Although not featuring a rare or unusual wildlife species, this is a most pleasing natural history genre entry. Highly commended. Aerobatics at sunset. The trick with sunset pictures is to avoid the result looking like a golden orb in a completely black background. Instead, find a location and choose a camera setting which results in a shot with a scene-setting foreground. In this entry, the lines of trees successfully inform us of the type of location and also provide an indication of the scale of the image. I'm surprised that aerobatics were being attempted in the evening. It seems a dangerous time of day to be carrying out that activity. However, the planes and the trails coming from them certainly add dynamism to what might otherwise have been a static image. I enjoy the added detail of the lights on the aircraft. A competent and creative entry. Merit. Eye on the ball. An appropriately titled, competent sports action shot that successfully captures the drama between individuals in a team game. I particularly appreciate the way the image depicts the determination on the faces of the players. Although the goalkeeper behind the two opponents is a little distracting, he is all part of the story. The image could handle a fraction more sharpening to give a cleaner look to the faces, and the photographer might consider cropping off the attraction-grabbing right-hand goalpost and small white line in the bottom right-hand corner of the image. A well-seen and storytelling picture. Merit. Grey Shrike Thrush. My first reaction on viewing this shot was competent, but the bird looks a bit drab. Then, Googling the web for details of the thrush, the first description I read said, the grey shrike thrush is a rather drab-coloured bird. So I must at least congratulate the photographer for producing an accurate depiction of the thrush. I must also say well done on capturing the bird's feather detail and bright eye. I find some of the light areas in the background distracting, and the photographer might like to consider converting the picture to a vertical image by cropping off most of the branches on the left-hand side of the image. This would also have the effect of positioning the thrush's eye on one of the thirds of the shot. Another well-seen and pleasing picture. Merit. Mirror Lakes. Methinks that somebody has visited New Zealand. If you look for Mirror Lakes on the web, you may come across a site which offers the following photographic advice. Get down low to capture the reflections from an interesting angle. Don't be tempted to use a wide lens. It'll make the foreground too prominent and the mountains less significant. Think about framing options. Trees and greenery can create a nice frame to your shot. I'm not too sure that I agree totally with these comments, but they are worth considering. In this instance, the photographer seems to have chosen a reasonably wide-angle lens and used the trees and mountains to frame the waterway. Landscapes are enhanced by a distinct foreground, and in this case, that role is taken by the hebe and flax bushes. The chosen viewpoint allows the water to act as a lead into the picture. That leading line doesn't take us out of the shot because we are held in the frame by the area of trees and shadow that swing our gaze round to the left and up to the mountains. We don't have any totally amazing reflections, but in this instance, I don't think that this was the aim of the photographer. On my screen, the image could be improved by an overall lightening of the image, particularly in the shadows areas. A competent, creatively composed and most agreeable picture. Merit. Solo search. Oystercatchers are pretty territorial birds, and I can imagine this one becoming quite noisy and agitated by any photographer it regards as being in its area, particularly so if it was nesting time. The bird is certainly giving the photographer a beady eye, and that eye is well captured, as is the rest of the oystercatcher, with good detail in the black feathering and a strong colouring to the beak and legs. Positioned off-centre of the frame, in its typical environment, the bird, although not rare or unusual, has been most competently and creatively photographed. A strong nature image. Merit. Bay of Fires. There is no shortage of drama in this entry. The orange and red lichens draw our eyes into the scene, while the creative option of long exposure has smoothed out the water hitting the rocks to almost give the rocks the appearance of being surrounded by a blue halo. The trees provide height to the image, and the distant landform provides depth to the scene. The photographer might consider cropping off some of the sky to produce a panorama format, but that is a nitpicking suggestion to a most competent and creative entry that communicates admirably the nature of the Bay of Fires. Honours. Bowerbird lunch. Not an abominable snowman, but certainly something I don't see in the New Zealand bush, so a creative image in this judge's eye. This entry fulfills all the parameters for a good natural history image. The bird is central to the story and is very well depicted, with boxes for feather detail, colour and sharp eye all ticked. The distant background is blurred and unobtrusive, while the foreground tells the story of the bird's nature, with the sticks hinting at a bower construction and the assorted foreground items alluding to the bird's collecting instincts. Are any improvements needed? Around the bird's head, a boundary line gives the appearance of oversharpening. This could be corrected without a significant loss of detail in the overall picture. A most pleasing image. Honours. Old church. I found this a difficult image to critique. Yes, there is an old church, or at least a section of one, but the most attention-grabbing part of the picture is the modern building with the lit-up rooms in the background. There are also construction cranes and beautifully lit trees, the latter of which dominate a large area of the picture. The title seems to say that the image is simply about the church, but the story I read from the picture is about the part the church plays, or perhaps does not play, in the fast-moving times of life today. Depicted in cool tones, the church looks cold, empty, deserted and unwelcoming, whilst the building behind, shown in warm tones, looks modern, bright and welcoming. Is this all meant to be a representation of the attitudes of our current society? The church, the building or the institution, and all it represents is being rejected in favour of instant gratification offered by the works of Mammon. What part do the trees play in this story? Maybe they show that, regardless of man's actions, nature will survive in some form or other. The fact that I can read the message in this picture, regardless of how fanciful that message might be, and whether or not it is the message that the photographer intended, indicates to me that this is a successful photograph. My only advice for the photographer is to change the image title. Honours. Pink Finger Orchid. An extremely well-captured portrait of this very, very small but beautiful orchid. The photographer has succeeded in depicting all parts of the flower to the extent that one of the many orchid addicts around would be able to name the species from the photograph. My guess is that it's Caladinia bartoleti or Caladinia carnea. But I'm supposed to be judging images, not naming orchids. The background has been kept mainly unobtrusive, though I would suggest cropping the image to a vertical format to remove the slightly distracting brown stem on the right of the flower. Excellent work. Honours. Great Egret. I won't call up Sherlock Holmes again, but there is something strange about this entry. It almost appears as if the egret has been lifted from its original image and pasted onto a black background. The uneven lighting has left the bird's head in dark shadow, whilst some of its chest feathers are in good light. With some work in levels, this situation might be corrected, and then, as the bird is otherwise competently portrayed, an acceptable image might be obtained. As presented, this entry has no award. Loco Graveyard. Decaying cars, tractors, trucks and trains are favourite subjects for photographers. With all the possibilities such items present for capturing shapes, textures and general past their use-by-date details, that popularity is not surprising. There are shapes and textures here, but the ones that are immediately in our faces are not on the locomotives, but rather on the wooden beams with the iron bracketing. Perhaps the photographer could not or was not allowed to get nearer to the locomotives. But my thoughts are that closer to the trains, better opportunities might have existed to convey the nature of the graveyard. This image might be simplified and improved by cropping off the area to the left of the end of the wooden beam and so concentrating the viewer's attention only on the steam engine. If possible, a revisit to the graveyard might prove most worthwhile. No award. Southwest Mountains. Although the water edge successfully acts as a leading line, taking my view from the foreground vegetation around the water and to the mountains in the background, I'm faced with a worrying situation. It's that sky. Frankly, it looks far too dramatic for the more relaxed atmosphere that seems to pervade the rest of the image. There is also a distinct halo boundary line between the mountaintops and the sky. It makes me think that either the sky has been imported from another image or the photographer has been too heavy-handed with their adjustment of contrast or sharpening. Lightening the image and lowering the contrast levels may help to ease this situation. No award. The Church, Port Arthur. A different sort of viewpoint from an old building with part of another building acting as foreground. Maybe because this shot was taken with a fairly wide-angle lens, some of the lines in the image that should be vertical, the church tower for example, are unfortunately not quite vertical. In photography, lines that are drastically away from where they should in fact be horizontal or vertical are deemed to be design features. Lines only slightly off horizontal or vertical are called mistakes. I find the strange black area between the church fence and the paving stones attention-grabbing. If the resolution of the original shot allows it cropping off the area below the point at which the black area meets the foreground wall, together with some of the sky and some of the right-hand wall to create a square format picture, would concentrate attention on the church and even allow for the straightening of its tower. A good attempt that deserves further post-processing work to achieve its full potential. No award. Water drop. I feel sure that the photographer had fun creating this entry. Well done on giving water drop photography a go. Having seen quite a few examples of this type of image, I feel that the photographer needs to do a bit more to their image to make it stand out from the crowd, as it were. For example, rather than trying to refine the existing image into an outstanding water droplet shot, why not use it as the base for another type of picture? Cropping off the top half of the image, where a lot of negative space is, not making a particularly positive addition to the shot, and then following it by experimenting with extreme adjustments of colour. Contrast and sharpening might produce a real in-the-viewer's face abstract image. This entry has potential which I hope can be realised by some inventive post-production. As presented, it has no award. New Zealand Vista. Yet another competently photographed image with a good tonal range that left me somewhat perplexed. What is intended to be the main subject here? The distant landscape or the foreground cars? A simple definition of the word vista is pleasing view, but originally the word meant avenue-like view. Neither definition helps this judge much. Surely the pleasing view shouldn't include cars, unless of course you happen to be a petrol head. Perhaps the picture is meant to be an indictment of the effects of excessive tourist numbers in New Zealand. Alternatively, perhaps it's simply a record shot of what the photographers saw when they stopped at a lookout point. An acceptance. Not for sale. The writing tells us that the vessel is not for sale, but to my mind, the state of the boat would deter most people from either buying it or certainly attempting to sail it anywhere. The highlights on the foreground grass are somewhat distracting. Cropping off a lot of the grass would improve the picture and still tell the sad story of this neglected craft. An acceptance. Staying dry. A good idea for a fun photo. The success in such shots is dependent on making the setup situation look realistically believable. For that to be the case with this picture, I think that rather than looking at the photographer, the balancing figure would be more interested in looking at the stones and where her feet are being placed. There should also be no nosy people in the background. Although the stones are sharply depicted, that sharpness falls off somewhat on the figure's face. Yes, I'm being a grumpy old judge with a picture that I hope was fun to make. And, as stated earlier, photography should be fun. Well done for making and entering the image. I hope that no one got too wet in the process. And acceptance. An eye on you. A competent nature image which I assume depicts a member of the Dacelo genus, a kookaburra. By now you will know that my checklist for acceptable bird portraits includes feather detail, eye detail, appropriate environment and activity. This kookaburra photograph receives a tick for all of these points, except the activity entry. For a more creative image, if the bird were doing something such as eating the latest lizard catch, rather than spending time giving the photographer the eye. Suggested improvements? Maybe crop off some of the right-hand area of the picture to produce a vertical image. Although this would make the bird more central in the frame, it would also make it more prominent and would remove some of the branches and the light areas in amongst the trees, both of which have the potential to be attention-grabbing. Highly commended. Doe and Joey. Some well-captured fur textures in this picture. The Joey engenders a certain reaction from me for its cuteness and gaze towards the photographer, while my interest on the doe concentrates on those rather vicious-looking claws. After a very short time, however, my attention is drawn to the out-of-focus other animal in the top left-hand corner of the frame. Annoyingly, my attention returns to that point even though I tell myself to concentrate on the main subjects. In a strict natural history competition, drastic post-production is often a denied option, but this is an open competition, so almost anything goes. Clone out that annoying animal in the corner. Unfortunately, after this has been done, the image seems to have become unbalanced, and the direction faced by the doe seems to lead our view out of the right-hand side of the shot. Any cropping out is because the animal's tails fill most of the length of the frame, so flip the image horizontally. Now, as we naturally read left to right, the doe's direction halts our attention path and instead diverts our view to the joey. As presented, this image is highly commended. Graceful busker. Some pleasing absolute blacks and absolute whites that make the busker stand out well from the tonally grey background in this image. As with the Doe and Joey image, it's the background that's a concern in this picture. If the busker was surrounded by a crowd of onlookers watching her performance, we would have a strong photojournalistic shot. As it is, we have just a couple of people in the background, one of whom seems totally uninterested in the busker and the other of whom seems to be observing but disconnected from what is going on. That's a story. Perhaps it tells us that busking in this location is at odds with the usual activities of the street and bystanders are studiously ignoring the woman's actions. I would be tempted to crop the shot to remove these people and so be content with an image that emphasises the actions of busker as the story to be told. A competent and unusual image, highly commended. Lemurs. I read that a correct noun for a collection of lemurs is a conspiracy, and the technique they employ to work or conspire together against an adversary is known as a mobbing. My first impression when viewing this image of ring-tailed lemurs was that although the shot was competent, it did look rather confusing with all those different heads, tails, paws so close together. Now, knowing the definition for a group of lemurs, I can appreciate that these three really do appear as if they are in a conspiracy and preparing to carry out a mobbing. A retitling of the image to a conspiracy of lemurs might be a good idea. This is a very competent image with good tonal range and sharply depicted subject matter. Compositionally, I still wish that even if they are in a conspiracy, the lemurs had been photographed in a more pleasing arrangement with the whole body of at least one animal depicted. As submitted, the entry represents good work and is worthy of a highly commended. Equinox Solace, a most competent and attractively composed image. On first looking at the shot, I was uncertain which of the two equinox was depicted. Based on the flower and buds in the picture, I've opted for spring. I can visualise myself sitting on the bench viewing the awakening life evident in the trees and the plants, perhaps smelling the fragrance of spring growth and enjoying being comforted by the prospect of another season and another year. That's the story I read from this image. But where is the old person sitting on the bench? They have to be old. Everyone needs comfort and reassurance, but especially the old. The figure on the bench is the vital part missing from the message that this picture is communicating to me. Nevertheless, an appealing and creative entry, a merit. My shadow. This has been a difficult image to critique, which probably means it is a successful picture. At first, I thought the shadow was not really that of the person in the picture, who I thought was a man, but instead was meant to be that of his partner. Thus the man was out and about, but still under the watchful eye of his better half. I still haven't completely dismissed this fanciful idea because it seems such a good story. However, I'm becoming more convinced that the shadow really does belong to the person in the picture, which means the message communicated by the image is not abundantly clear, to me at least. The street environment with its graffiti and wire-meshed windows seems to indicate that this is not an area where law-abiding citizens loiter. The angle of the limbs of the shadow almost seem to be urging the walker to get a move on. We don't want to hang around here. A competent and well-seen image that is successful in providing the viewer with a wide choice of interpretations. Merit. Sad face. Black and white images can often excel in depicting texture and form. This entry is a good example of that. The subject matter is the bovine's head, but what the picture really brings to our attention is the hairiness of that head, the strong curve of the beast's horns and their scarred surface, and the drops of moisture on the animal's nose. Contrary to the usual requirement of animal images, in this shot the eyes do not feature strongly, though we can see some hairy eyelashes. I wonder if the eyes had been shown, the story of the picture would have been more about the personality of the creature rather than about the nature of its head. We might then have known whether it was really sad or was perhaps just pondering. As presented, a competent, creative and appealing image. Merit. The calf. If you have taken in the remarks I have made about black and white work, you will know without me telling you what appeals to me about this image. It's not so much the plain, unobtrusive background, not so much the calf's direct stare at the camera, not so much the carefully considered backlit lighting, and not so much the precise focusing. It's the well-seen and well-depicted texture of the calf's coat. The coat even seems to give evidence of what parts of its flank the calf can lick and which parts it has failed to reach. There may be some margin to adjust the exposure on this competent and creative image, but if that is attempted, all efforts must be made to ensure that the texture is retained. Good work, a merit. There is just one more entry for me to critique, but before I do that, and you then all start debating the pros and cons of your results and my judging, may I firstly thank you again for asking me to look at and comment on your images. And secondly, say that it's a lonely place out here in judging land. I would love to hear your thoughts on my critiquing. For good or ill, your thoughts are valuable guides to the future judging assignments I accept. Many thanks in anticipation, and so on to the final entry. Sulphur-crested cockatoo, an image that passes all the tests for accurately depicted bird species and fulfills the potential for black and white photography to illustrate texture and form. Some judges would bemoan the lack of more detailed background, but for me, the precision and simplicity of the image outweigh any need for further elaboration. Competent, creative, and communicating a forceful image of beauty and successful design in nature, this is an honours.